Imagine the city's most fashionable people mixing. The intensity at its highest level. A crowded dance floor. Strobe lights that paint the audience in electric color flashes. The bass resonating through the air and drinks flowing. Young Jock and Kirk Frost were dressed to impress. But their target was none other than Lil Scrappy, a man whose contagious charm could light up any space. It was an emotional, dramatic, and confrontational battle that will never be forgotten. Began. Gradually, with a few sharp looks, silent discussions, and a storm boiling beneath the surface. And then it occurred. The mood swiftly shifted from exuberance to astonishment, and soon the dance floor center was a sight that everyone could not take their eyes off. While others paused, too frightened to respond, others frantically grabbed their phones to record the drama. But it wasn't just a quarrel. It was a full-fledged confrontation that left the whole club wondering how heated things were before the security guards showed up and what made Kirk and Jock confront Scrappy so bravely. The strobe lights pulsed in sync with the strong bass, providing fleeting, broken glimpses of faces as the main dance floor was a swarm of moving bodies swaying to the DJ's most recent set. It was the kind of night that people had been talking about for weeks, with loud music, flashing lights, and a throng that appeared to be getting more excited by the minute. But the atmosphere inside the Atlanta nightclub was already at its height. Some of the most stylish and well-connected people in the city had lined up around the block to get in. There was a different feeling growing up in the VIP section. However, Kirk Frost and Young Jock were seated in their allocated booth. There, entourages bustling around them, so it wasn't a celebration. With their high-end suits and accessories that quietly shouted success, the two men looked dapper. At first look, they seemed at ease, talking, laughing, and drinking pricey liquor. The bar was surrounded by small groups of people who were shouting over the noise and balancing their cocktails. Their encounters had a certain sharpness that had not been seen on any of their prior high-profile evenings. Those in their immediate vicinity were either unaware of it or too preoccupied to appreciate the advantages of being connected to two of the most well-known people in the city. Lil Scrappy was the focal point of his own scene in another VIP booth across the floor. Where Kirk and Jock appeared to be reflecting, Scrappy got to his feet, radiating charisma. More precisely, Jock's laugh was a sliver too late, and Kirk's smile fell short of his eyes. He was obviously having fun among a close-knit group of pals, as seen by his infectious smile, his arms moving in rhythm with the beat, and his laugh booming over the music. Many came to pay their respects, and the drinks were raised swiftly. Scrappy had a reputation for having a captivating personality that could transform ordinary evenings into memorable occasions. Behind the scenes, things weren't as carefree as they seemed, but tonight seemed no different. Juke and Kirk looked back and forth toward what was not obviously Scrappy's booth. When she sensed the change, a waitress carrying a tray of beverages to their booth paused, her gaze darting from Jock's narrowed eyes to Kirk's clenched jaw. Without a word, she set down the tray and rushed on. But as the minutes passed, the small clues began to accumulate. As the music continued to boom, Kirk pushed closer to the Jock, his mouth moving rapidly. After a brief period of darkening, the Jock nodded while maintaining a steady focus on Scrappy. It was clearly more than small talk. Whatever they were discussing was in his zone, breaking away from his sitting company to make his way toward the dance floor while clinking glasses with some of his old friends. He didn't display it if he was aware that people on the other side of the club were observing him. "You see what I'm seeing?" The Jock asked, his voice barely audible over the thumping bass. As he leaned closer to Kirk and watched him leave, his jaw clenched. Kirk was too focused on every move Scrappy made to answer immediately, but after a while he nodded. He answered yes in a calm voice. Spent years in the same social circles, attended the same events, and met on the same stages. Those close to them were aware of the underlying difficulties, even though their public contacts had often seemed to be cordial enough. For Kirk and Jock, Scrappy was a favorite and a source of conflict due to his developing star status, confident demeanor, and penchant for voicing his opinions. It was about what the man stood for, not just about him. Scrappy's reckless demeanor and rising fame were perceived by some as a danger, particularly if they came at the expense of other people in the same. The whole dance floor erupted. The lights flashed faster, the throng drew closer together, and the energy of the evening peaked when the DJ changed to a new song. Without a word to their friends, Kirk and Jock left their booth and began to make their way through the crowd, blazing a trail straight for Scrappy. On the edge of the dance floor, he was totally absorbed in the music. He raised his glass in recognition as a few fans screamed out his name. Although he was unaware of Kirk and Jock's approach, others nearby performed a small pocket of the two men's assured. Deliberate steps contrasted sharply with the frantic motions of the dancers, surrounding them as the audience turned to observe. It was too late to evade them by the time Scrappy looked up. The Jock took a step toward Kirk, who halted a few feet away with his hands in his pockets. The music appeared to shift in the air around them, and a sudden oppressive silence descended on their immediate surroundings. As he took stock of the situation, Scrappy straightened his stance, lowered his drink a little, and his smile faded. Kirk didn't answer right away, instead glancing at Scrappy with an enigmatic face before continuing. He said in a low, even voice, "You've been running your mouth, causing drama, if you understand what I mean." Scrappy tightened his hold on the glass in his hand and arched an eyebrow. Some of them were standing there staring at Kirk and Juke. The tiny group of spectators leaned in, feeling that something was going to happen because of the obvious tension between the two groups. With assurance, he glanced back at his booth where his team was now on high alert. He knew that Scrappy was the one in the altercation because no one moved despite a few whispering to one another. Studying his posture, he turned back to Kirk and Jock and said, "If you have anything to say, say it." Jock moved forward, bringing them closer together. His body language was composed, but his eyes were tense. With a voice sharp enough to cut through the din, he remarked, "We've got plenty to say, okay? And if you're clever, you'll pay attention." But Scrappy didn't give up. "Oh, like what?" With a hint of defiance in his voice, he inquired. For the first time, he seemed prepared to protect himself, his fist balled at his side. He moved slightly forward, bringing himself about level with the Jock. The stress of a developing confrontation caused the audience around them to shift uneasily, with some people moving closer and others retreating farther away. The location where Kirk Frost, young Jock, and Lil Scrappy stood had become a hotspot, and the nightclub CL was more than simply a place to dance and drink. Even though the lights were still flashing, the music was still thumping, and people were still dancing and laughing. The vibe in this particular corner of the room was totally with their eyes flitting between the three men. Scrappy's crew held their breath in heightened alertness. Near the booth, some were standing while others were covered, having urgent yet quiet chats. Some of them looked at each other uneasily, trying to read the situation. Scrappy was still at odds with Kirk and Jock verbally. Conflict wasn't new to him, but this one felt different for some reason. The stakes were personal, and it wasn't a heated argument on TV with cameras rolling. Kirk stepped forward, his face colder than ever, saying, "But don't come at me with these weak accusations, unless you have something solid." Scrappy lifted his chin and narrowed his eyes, saying, "If I have something to say, I'll say it." He pointed the finger at Scrappy, saying, "You've been talking out of line and spreading lies. You think you can just run your mouth and not face the consequences?" Scrappy said it. "We have receipts. We both know the truth. But you want to hide what you've been saying behind our back box, which is okay." Asterisk before he held up the tablet. Scrappy's jaw tensed as the glare from the gadget reflected off his face. He squinted at whatever was on screen, but the force of Kirk's gesture was sufficient. "Now you're going to show me some out of context messages? That's your proof, man?" He waved a dismissive hand and said, Miss me with that nonsense." His posture betrayed a different message as he leaned back almost imperceptibly, as if he was getting ready for the next move. But his voice was less confident than before, with a slight crack in his confidence, showing that his bravado was still intact. "You've been playing both sides, saying one thing to us and another to everyone else," he continued, standing close to Kirk, practically shoulder to shoulder. Scrappy's rage bubbled over, and he set his shoulders and planted his feet, confronting the two men directly. "You think you can come in here and press me? It's time to own up before this gets worse. Who are you, in your opinion?" His voice was so low that it was nearly lost in the music, but it was powerful enough to give Scrappy a chill. He whispered, and then Kirk suddenly moved forward, entering Scrappy's personal space. The jock clenched his fists, Kirk narrowed his eyes, and Scrappy's crew edged closer, ready to jump in. And then the crowd around them fell into a tense silence, the lights and music almost meaningless, and everyone was watching, waiting for what felt inevitable. Instead of flinching, however, Scrap stood his ground, his gaze locked with Kirk's. "Kami," he stepped between them. He stepped between them and said, "All right, that's enough." His voice was firm, and he placed a hand on Kirk's shoulder and pushed him back a step, gently but firmly. "Take it outside or take a seat." Kirk didn't protest, but he kept his eyes on Scrappy. And as his defensive stance held, the jock relaxed a little and stepped back as well. Scrappy exhaled slowly, his posture loosening as the immediate threat passed. And his crew stood there, their gazes darting between Scrappy and the two men who had been inches away from throwing the first punch. The security guard motioned for Kirk and the jock to return to before turning and walking away with Kirk back toward their VIP section. Scrappy didn't move at first. Instead, he stood motionless, his breath still a little heavier than usual as his crew began muttering around him. "I don't care who you are," he said in an unyielding tone. "This isn't the place for that." For a moment, it seemed like Kirk and Jock might refuse, but Kirk nodded and put his phone back in his pocket. "We'll settle another time," he said, lowering his voice so that only those closest could hear him. They asked in a worried tone, "I'm good, Scrappy." And he picked up his drink, took a slow sip, and turned toward his booth. They were all talking. Always had been. But as he sat down, he couldn't get rid of the feeling that this wasn't over the looks Kirk and Jock had given him when they first approached him. As the night went on, the tension continued. And Kirk and Juke had returned to their booth, but they weren't drinking or talking like before. Instead, they sat quietly, their faces set in stone eyes. However, Scrappy had done his best to shake off the altercation, and back in his booth, he was surrounded by his crew, who were clearly still on edge, speaking in low voices and displaying tense body language, as if any sudden movement might trigger the confrontation again. Scrappy sipped his drink, remaining calm. But those closest to him could see that the encounter had left him uneasy, and their relationship had changed from one of a couple seeking a good time to one of a couple. It didn't matter that the altercation hadn't turned physical. Rumors turned it into something much bigger by the time the club's members heard about it. He wasn't scared, not exactly, but he knew that this wasn't over, and he was right. Word of the altercation quickly spread throughout the club, and witnesses began sharing what they saw, embellishing details for dramatic effect. One woman said that Kirk and Juke had been ready to swing while a man at the bar told his friends that Scrappy had stood them down like a champ. Customers started pulling out their phones, and the story was already taking on a life of its own. A shaky video, shot from across the room, began to circulate on social media, showing just Kirk and the jock standing in front of Scrappy. The tension was noticeable, but it was enough. And within minutes, hashtags like #J got receipts, #Kirk versus Scrappy, and #Club Drama ATL were trending. The club's staff, trying to keep things organized, quickly realized that the night's events had put them at the center of a viral moment. Kirk checked his phone and saw the hashtags, the videos. And he leaned toward the jock and showed him the screen, talking like we're the bad guys. And Kirk muttered in a low, tense voice that, "We started this." The jock shook his head, saying, "It's just noise, but maybe it's time we set the record straight." Kirk nodded, but his expression didn't soften. So the comments flowed in. Some people were rooting for him, and the jock was saying that Scrappy had finally gotten what he deserved. The public spectacle added fuel to the fire, and Kirk's frustration grew. One of his friends turned the screen toward him as the crew watched the same social media storm unfold on their phones, saying, "You're a legend, man." He tried to lighten the situation by saying, "They're calling you the king of the club." Scrappy forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, sure," he said, but he pointed to Kirk and Jock's booth, where they were sitting, plotting. "You think this is the end?" "No, they're just getting started." As the club began to wind down, the audience dispersed and individuals continued to share stories and discuss what had transpired as they trickled out into the some people lingered in the parking lot, wondering what would happen next. The buzz had reached a fever pitch, and everyone who had been there that night felt like they were part of something bigger than just a night out. It was a narrative that everyone wanted to follow. Kirk and Jock finally got up. They hadn't had another drink or spoken much to each other since the confrontation. The tension between them and Scrappy was so great that words weren't needed. Kirk and Jock exchanged a glance before saying, "Let's go." His best friend leaned in and whispered something to him, but Scrappy just shook his head, thinking, "No, it isn't over." The air was cooler outside the club, but the atmosphere was still charged because a group of people had gathered. And the two men left as quietly as they had approached earlier in the evening, but their silence didn't mean they were finished. Rather, it meant they were getting ready for their next move. There were some of them talking excitedly about what had happened that night, while others were scrolling through their phones near the valet station, while others turned to watch. Kirk and Juke passed them without a word, and despite their weight, people stepped aside to give them space, as if the tension from the club was still with them. They got into their car, shut the doors, and drove off, the glow from their phones lighting up the interior as they scrolled through the online reactions. And for every person who was praising Scrappy's poise, someone else was calling. After a long period, Kirk replied, "You know what we need to do?" And Jock gave him a knowing smile as his face hardened as he scanned the comments, which were a battlefield. Slowly, he nodded. They didn't have to explain that. Although the altercation in the club may have ended, the real fight was just beginning. That's where we are, my friends. It's your turn now. What do you think really happened in that nightclub? Do you think Kirk and Jock have something to prove, or is Scrappy just the most recent? Tensions are rising, alliances are disintegrating, and questions remain unanswered. The story isn't over yet. The fallout from this explosive night is just getting started. Are you the target of some backstage drama? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. And don't forget to hit the bell icon, like this video, and subscribe to the channel so you can be the first to know what happens next.